Hello and welcome to All Indians Matter. I'm Ashraf Engineer. If the current trend of urbanization persists, and it will, India will have more than 60 cities with a population of more than 1 million each and 6 megacities with populations of at least 10 million each by 2030. Mumbai and Delhi are already among the world's most populated cities and perhaps among the most chaotic. There's a lot to be desired in terms of urban management. The growing Indian urban population will strain resources like water and energy, infrastructure like roads, services like waste management and public transport, and even education and healthcare. So, how we manage our resources and plan infrastructure and services will be critical. Increasingly, it is being understood that technology will have a huge role to play. Cities across the world have begun to see the potential of data driven governance, and it's time to address the challenges in implementing technology and data driven urban governance initiatives in India.
All Indians matter.
We have on the show Sarayu Natarajan, founder of Aapti Institute, which works on questions at the intersection of technology and society. Aapti works on inclusion, access, governance of technologies and data governance through its two labs, the Digital Public Lab and the Data Economy Lab. Sarayu has a PhD in Political Science from King's College London, an MPA from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and a BA LLB Honours from the National Law School of India University, Bangalore. She has previously worked at McKinsey & Company, Elivar Equity, and Grey Matters Capital. Welcome, Sarayu.
Hi, Ashraf. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sarayu, why is technology such a game changer in urban governance, and how does technology revolutionize access to services?
Right. Thank you for the question, and glad to jump straight into the conversation. I think technology has enormous potential in the context of urban governance. I think that it can actually transform service delivery in a significant way. But of course, and we'll come to that hopefully in the course of this conversation, but it's not free of challenges. I think one of the big advantages of technology is that it can reduce friction in service delivery, and a lot of decisions that are fairly straightforward or almost robotic. I don't know if that's the right word, but essentially decisions that can be made with a simple set of criteria. Technology can do the verification and decision making, and some of these can be encoded. And just to give you an example, if certain criteria are met, let's say there's a question of issuing a certificate. That is, you've paid your taxes, all your details are uploaded, all your identity documentation is uploaded. If that means that the decision is fairly straightforward or it's a matrix that can be easily encoded, technology is very, very useful. I think the other advantage of technology, and it's less visible, is that it can aggregate across contexts. So let's say, for example, you're seeing a set of challenges around street lights, let's say, in one area. What technology could do is give people visibility into challenges that are occurring of a similar nature across, so it's easily able to identify or at least sort of signal the likelihood of systemic and structural issues. The third is, and I hope to discuss this as well over the course of this conversation, it can log and generate data. So just like in the street lights example, you're able to get a sense of what's happening. There's a digital record of the occurrence of certain problems. It also creates digital records of remedies. For example, if somebody's complained about something, there's a record of how it has happened. So what that means for urban governance in and of itself, it can bring about a certain amount of accountability. So service level agreements that governments have with respect to delivering services, those can be tracked, so you can have a sense of who's performing, where the performance is coming from, and if there are challenges, they can be proactively addressed. So what technology does is, in its own way, increase access, it visibilizes problems, and it reduces friction. And each of these has its own challenges, but hopefully we'll discuss that over the course of this conversation.
Yeah, we absolutely will. I think all 3 points are very important that you've raised. But there's a more fundamental question, Sarayu, and that is that it's all very well to say that technology will change lives, but in a country where technology access remains a problem, how do you overcome that? And what are the key challenges to transforming urban governance through technology then?
Right. Technology is not free of its own problems. And I think in some of our work, particularly around citizenship, in the context of urban service delivery, but also more broadly looking at the nature of local participation, we find that technology can have two big harms. One is it can exacerbate existing challenges in and of itself. So there are social problems. Women, for example, generally disadvantaged with respect to accessing a whole range of things, including public services. So it exacerbates existing societal problems. And it can also have a tendency of bringing its own set of challenges with it. So it sort of worsens the old, and it brings in its own new set of challenges. But again, none of them are insurmountable, but one should be cautious in terms of thinking about them and understanding them a little bit better. I think I'll focus on two key challenges. One is the question of access, and I think you alluded to it in your question. India is a country where access is unequal, and while the evidence suggests that urban areas are ahead, it still remains quite a significant challenge. And access goes, ranging from access to devices and Wi-Fi to access in a more sort of normative sense, in that women, disadvantaged communities face a hesitance in accessing public systems. So there's both kinds of access, but in a country like India, where these sort of reinforce social divides, one must be very conscious of thinking about the use of technology. And the second challenge, of course, and I think it's a little bit more complicated, is that urban service delivery is often tied up with political parties and political service providers and sort of political agents on the ground. Now, per se, I refuse to think of it as a problem in and of itself. But what it does is that it complicates the delivery of urban services to society. And this is an existing challenge which can get exacerbated by technology, because it, tends to invisibilize various things. Like there's a decision making that's outside of yourself. You can't see how the document is moving. We've had people on the ground tell us that पहले we could go and see governments किसी से कुछ पूछ सकते थे, but now we can't. And so in a situation where technology tends to invisibilize, intersection with political service delivery can be a challenge. And political service delivery, just to sort of elaborate on that a little bit more, what I mean is that intermediaries who help people access the state. So previously, if you wanted a birth certificate in the absence of technology, you would usually go to a local dude, for lack of a better word, and they call different people in different things in different parts of the world. Here they're called boss, some people call them guru, some people call them leader, some people call them neta. In Tamil Nadu, it's called taleva. So, there's sort of different terms that are used. Bhai, yes, I would imagine so. So there's a local bhai who helps you. And to say that the bhai is completely decoupled from the political system is not necessarily true. And a lot of service delivery that the bhai or the taleva does is linked up to the ability to generate votes from a particular place. Now, what that means is then, the partisanship could creep in to urban service delivery, which is that you only deal with the problems of the people that vote for your political party. And when that starts to happen, it inhibits wider access to public services in a meaningful way. And that can become problematic. And when layered on with the fact that technology tends to make things invisible, now you would earlier go and ask the bhai, and if the bhai didn't respond, you could go to the local municipal office, at least in theory. I mean, let's not get too wrapped up or romanticize the idea that the offline is better, but at least in theory, you could walk over to the local municipal office, you could catch a hold of the local engineer, you could do multiple things. Whereas now what that might mean is there's an invisibility for people. And this is, again, it replicates pre-existing patterns in society. People who have access will continue to do so, whether it's offline or online. But the moment you sort of start to think about online-only systems, women, marginalized communities, communities without education, they start to get affected. So these, I would say, are two big problems. But if you think about the framework of it exacerbates what's already there, brings with it its whole new set of problems, I think you can end up with a very deadly mix that excludes a lot of people.
Yeah. Which brings me to smart cities. Sarayu, on June 25, 2015, the government launched the Smart Cities mission. I think they selected 99 cities and budgeted just over 2 lakh crore to improve the way they are managed. Now, we don't hear much about that initiative now. What do you think went wrong?
It's very tempting to say that it's just one of those several government programs that didn't take off, and there are some that do and some that don't. But I think there are a few specific challenges with respect to smart cities that might have played in. And I also do think that smart cities, as a consequence, and I'll sort of elucidate what those challenges might have been, is an idea a little bit ahead of its time. And I think there are several structural challenges that need to be better understood, better unpacked before we jump into conversations about smart cities as a holistic and a complete idea. First, of course, is that, the challenge around, while there was a budgetary allocation, there wasn't necessarily a set of financing mechanisms that were clearly available at the state level. So there are sort of different ways the budgetary allocation was made, and as government allocations are, they're theoretical, and the ability for states, cities to claim them, the process was not necessarily very clear. So there became a challenge of financing, which means that enterprises that needed money were not necessarily able to access it. So there was a lot of lack of clarity around the budget financing piece of it. The second piece of it that's worth thinking about is two types of friction. One is the federal politics and sometimes the challenges in coordination between the center and different states. States have their own priorities, and there's sometimes friction that arises from different political parties being in power. It's historically been something that has been highlighted as a challenge in urban governance and urban governance literature, but it can play in very many ways in terms of implementation on the ground, because the state holds very many of the budgets. Or at least the budgetary control and the accountability. And what also happens is that state governments are often held accountable for urban problems. So that layer of political decision making creeps into how programs are implemented on the ground. I think the second aspect of this friction is the need for interministerial cooperation. And I think, unlike, I mean, one shouldn't comment and make a sweeping statement, but most programs that are imagined today cannot be directly placed within the remit of one department or one ministry or the other. Here, several institutions were involved at the central government level, and consequently several institutions at the state level were involved. There's MoHUA at the central level. There's, a Niti Aayog, which was doing some of the evidence generation in the context of the Smart Cities mission. There's a Smart Cities mission itself, which is housed, as far as I know, under MoHUA. So what that has meant is that there's a complex network of actors, institutions, interests, and that brings in a certain amount of complexity. I think the third big challenge with the smart cities, and I think this is a problem even in the judiciary, is that you're retrofitting to a already extremely complicated system. Now there's not just variation at different states. So Rajasthan and Maharashtra and Karnataka all vary between each other in terms of the way urban politics operates, the city level governments operate, etc. There's almost also often variation between two cities in the same states. So your Nashik is very different from Bombay, is like Bangalore is very different from Belgaum, and so you have an enormous amount of complexity in this system. In fact, complexity also is worsened by the lack of availability of information and data, which means that you don't even know what is there underneath. I have a very good friend who did a PhD on urban politics, and this was in Uttar Pradesh, and he spent 6 months trying to find a map of a city in Uttar Pradesh. And in fact, for a small period of time, he was even contemplating titling his PhD, "Why is it so hard to find a map in Uttar Pradesh?"
Why is it so hard to dash, dash, dash anything in Uttar Pradesh would be books by themselves, I suppose, but we should leave that discussion for another time.
Yeah, well, yes, of course. But the point makes itself, which is that there's a lack of visibility into problems. You're retrofitting into complex systems that have their own logic. And so if you put all of these three together, you're starting from a very difficult point with respect to the Smart Cities mission. So, of course, it has some of the commonly viewed challenges with respect to government programs that are announced with great aplomb and there isn't necessarily the follow through. But thinking about urban governance and thinking about technology and urban governance brings with it its very, very specific problems. And no matter, even a much watered down version of the smart cities mission would encounter struggles on the ground in terms of implementation. I mean, I have no doubt about it, but I think it's an idea that requires a lot of sort of levels of work.
Hmm. And but before we proceed, Sarayu, I just want to tell listeners that when you say MOHUA, you're referring to the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. I just wanted to make that
Thank you for clarifying that. As with any space, you just make assumptions about what people know. And as a podcast, I totally empathize with the need to clarify to listeners. I apologize.
Sarayu, much has been made about the use of data in urban governance. Could you give us everyday examples of how data can improve urban governance and how does it result in more sustainable urban governance?
Right. I think, data and the ability of technological systems to capture, generate, and analyze data is it's hard to undervalue the importance of that. What data does, I would say, is two things in the urban realm. One is that it enables spotting problems, and this could be through reporting. Some of it could be through proactive analysis from pre-existing data. It could be communities or organizations that are coming together to make data and information available to governments to enable decision making. So what it does is it creates visibility into, and this can be attributed to technology, but data is a specific lever that enables this. But you can see problems with much less difficulty, and you can see them across a bigger geographic horizon, which means that Bombay, I don't know how many wards, but Bangalore has some 200 odd wards. To see across problems across different parts of the city, the municipality has a better sense of what's happening where. So therefore it enables seeing problems. It makes allocation of resources which are anyway scarce more feasible to do. So you have a situation where data is able to inform decision making, rationalization of allocation of resources, etc., can be done. The second part of it, and I think we alluded to it in the earlier part of the conversation, is that it enables tracking and managing and delivery. And through it, it brings about a certain accountability of public systems. So Karnataka has something called the Sakala Act, which is a very specific context, but what it does is it promises the delivery of some urban services within periods of time. So when you have made an application, service delivery is promised. Similar legislations exist in different contexts, and I don't want to say they all relate to urban governance, but there are sort of agreements from the state that the legislature has made that are sort of commitments to the public. And of course, governance in a certain way falls within the broader realm of public services, which comes with values of non-discrimination, a certain amount of immediacy, all of those values. So what technology can do is it can make it visible, which is that or rather data can do is make it visible. So you can track what happened, how long it took, and it can also give you a better sense of what the problems are that come at each step of the journey. And that means you can have a certain amount of accountability in a public system. And I think these are the two big things. One is it can make things visible. You can see, you can identify what and react, and then it helps you build an accountable system.
But what about privacy concerns?
Oh, it's a significant concern. I think there's intersects with sort of various debates that are happening around the value of data, particularly community data that relates to groups of individuals, that can actually inform public policy decision making. It can bring about accountability, and in some sense it can also foster innovation. There's definitely a vibrant debate around this. So it intersects with those sort of public value of data questions, notions of individual and community privacy, as well as with ideas around like how can open data kind of conversations which relate to making data available for these decisions as well as for the benefit of communities. Most recently, Karnataka, I think, had a open data policy where they recommended that data be made available for innovation and design and businesses for a cost, which could then be accessed by these companies or firms and even civil society organizations. I think that was the imagination behind it, that it could be accessed and made use of in order to promote innovation and problem solving. But what that means is that there's a concomitant issue of privacy, both at the individual level, because de-anonymization, and I know a lot of people talk about it, but it's one of those challenges that's fairly well understood and fairly well solved. And at a community level, it poses significant threats. And I'll give you an example of how this might end up playing out. Public service delivery is not neutral, and we talked about it from the political sense. Governments, states, partisan elements are known to direct public resources into areas where they think there's some kind of electoral gain. There's a wide literature in political science, there is literature in the area of urban governance. So there's evidence that this happens. And, anybody who's lived in an Indian city knows what this means. Now, what technological systems end up doing is that when you make a complaint or you share information about yourself, you make a lot of things beyond what's in the paper of the application visible. So if you file a complaint from a certain neighborhood, it becomes apparent, you not just get to see who is filing the complaint or where it is, but the neighborhood, the location itself conveys information beyond. And technological systems do this at scale. And it of course was happening. And the constant answer a lot of people say is that, are you telling me it didn't happen in the past? But what technology does is it does it at scale, it does it without friction, and that means it brings about very significant dangers to people. So for example, we did some work around last mile access to urban governance, and one of the communities of people that we interviewed were a trans community. And they said, we have great hesitation in filing complaints because what this means is that government officials get to know where we live, and then it becomes a part of the record as to where. Previously in the offline system, though we faced hesitation with respect to going out to the government office and asking for help, it still was better because there was always a sympathetic official that we could speak to or reach out to. Now, what it does is there's a record that says where we live, and we can be exposed to harassment, we can be exposed to threats, and this can, trans is one identity, and there are sort of several identities that become politicized in different ways. And therefore, I think thinking about data as not just something that has some of the benefits of making things available, but can have significant impacts on people's day-to-day existence, and through that, privacy is something to keep in mind. Yeah. And I don't know if I answered the question, but the idea is that data can be complicated in its impact.
No, absolutely. I think it's very clear that what you're saying is that technology and data can have several solutions, but there are accompanying hazards that we need to be careful about. It's not an easy solution. It's not, just because you invest in technology or you have data at your disposal, it doesn't mean that it's some sort of panacea. I think that's what you're really trying to get at. Absolutely buy the argument. But Sarayu, let's talk about two key priorities, healthcare and transport. How would technology change that in, say, a metropolis like Bombay?
No, I think there's significant value for technology in each of these areas. And I think healthcare as well as transportation, mobility more broadly, do fall within the realm of urban life and urban living, but not necessarily within the domain of urban governance. So we have to sort of be careful to map the, not just the fact that these are conceptually have their own texture, but also the fact that they come under very different departments and institutions within the state level. So, just with that caution, diving into the role that technology might play, I think in healthcare, it's become fairly obvious over the course of the pandemic and is starting to become increasingly clear the role that technology can play. I think what it can do very critically in a metropolis where, access can be a challenge due to mobility issues, which we'll discuss subsequently, is that it can enhance delivery. So let's imagine your primary healthcare centers, your local mohalla clinics are equipped with the ability to, deal with some primary problems through a telemedicine system, are able to track in the way that we talked about in the context of urban governance. Similarly, in the context of technology, if they're able to track, let's say, the provision of vaccines, the provision of sort of various healthcare services, technology can play a significant role in easing the frictions around that. So community workers that are critically engaged in healthcare, Anganwadi workers that work with young children and mothers, they can all be empowered through technology. And this is not just in urban areas, but more broadly as well. But urban areas, there's a certain increase in productivity, which sees immediate gains in terms of the ability of these individuals to serve the community more widely. I think the second role that technology can play is specifically with respect to service providers themselves. There's evidence that they struggle with a lot of, struggle with the ability to deliver because they don't know what challenges are. They also struggle to access information about sort of the availability of public services with respect to health. So again, technology can play a role in sort of easing that and reducing the costs around that. And I think that the application around healthcare, my own sense is that it's fundamentally in the context of primary healthcare. Of course, there's the applications of technology with respect to secondary healthcare. A lot of these are already visible in institutions like hospitals. But from the public service point of view, I think these are sort of the two big areas. It can enable citizens and individuals to access health services, and it can also enhance the delivery of it, either through community workers or through doctors themselves. Interestingly, India has made very interesting investments in healthcare technology, in public healthcare technology, through the Ayushman Bharat digital mission. I think it's now called the Ayushman Bharat mission. They've gone through 3 changes in names, so I'll be a bit cautious here. But essentially what it does is it builds out a whole toolkit of digital assets that could be relevant from the perspective of health. And what it does is any innovator who wants to build a little local solution can use the Ayushman Bharat digital good toolkit in order to innovate for their community. And think of it in the most crude way as the UPI for health. So it's a set of digital systems that innovators, communities, anybody can use in order to build relevant solutions for there. So if you want to build an information system around vaccine delivery, you can use some components of the Ayushman Bharat stack to do so. So that is in the context of health, and I think it's interesting what digital can achieve. And of course, the same caveats that we talked about with respect to urban governance, we must take into account in the context of health. The additional layer in the context of health that I must put on the table, of course, is that there's a lot of sociological evidence that women struggle to access healthcare services. And they struggle because their challenges are minimized. In scarce resource allocation, the needs of males are prioritized. And there's also a lot of social stigma associated with several aspects of women's health. And digitization might bring an additional layer of invisibility to this and bring an additional layer of question of access. So I think, being very careful about how you think about digital health, even in urban contexts, is very, very relevant. Moving on to transportation and mobility, more broadly speaking, I think technology can play an interesting role again. I think one is, of course, it can enable sort of better visibilization of problems in the same way that it does in the context of governance, etc. What it can do is show you where challenges are likely to occur. So GIS information, video information, though of course one must be cautious about the debates around surveillance as well. Video information can inform you as to where trouble areas occur. It can reduce challenges like traffic issues. It can also play a role in informing policy making around climate and pollution specifically. So all of these sort of contribute to the broader question of mobility, but I think technology can play a significant role. And again, here in the context of transportation, mobility, and more broadly commerce, I think India has made a very interesting set of investments. And of course, again, caveat is these are all early stage and must be watched over the next 5 to 10 years or so. But India has built out what it's calling the Open Network for Digital Commerce, the ONDC. And it's a set similar to the ABDM, but this is with respect to mobility. The point being that mobility is fairly neutral. It can be me coming to a place somewhere else. It could be me sending a good, but the idea is you're transporting something from place A to place B. And what it's doing is, on that premise, it's built out a larger set of questions to enable mobility through the ONDC and the protocols that underlie the institution. Now, interestingly, to give you a live example, not very long ago, Karnataka regulators came down heavily on ride-hailing apps, particularly the auto component. They banned hailing autos through apps. Now, of course, this High Court reversed it and autos are back on your Uber and your Ola. But a local trade union, the ARDU, has used, through the support of a certain number of nonprofits, used the protocols that underlie ONDC to build out their own app, which they're calling Nammayatri. Now, what this means is that the ability to use technology has started to be available to more people. Of course, questions of governance, questions of safety and security, questions of even the service layer and skills to use these kinds of technological mechanisms need to be understood, and how that sort of all broadly fits into the broader question of urban mobility is to be unpacked a little bit more. But here you're starting to see technology play a significant role in empowering communities to solve problems in a very local and a very relevant way. So, Nammayatri, I think that's what the app is called, is very relevant to Karnataka, is very relevant to Bangalore's context. They have fixed fares. They govern it for a very Bangalore-specific set of issues, which is that if I call a pickup even from a 1 kilometer away, it could end up taking the driver 25 minutes to come here just because of traffic, which
Yeah,
needs to be
Bangalore's
priced
famous
in a
traffic,
little
or I
bit.
should say infamous traffic. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm more used to it than others, but I tend to think of it as not too bad, but I guess it's just a question of living in a better place and then realizing how bad things are here.
Yeah, it's amazing
Yeah.
how some of these major problems or hurdles we just kind of accept it and say, okay, this is part of life, and we just continue. For instance, travel in Mumbai's local trains. I mean, to the outsider, it's abysmal, but most Mumbaikars just take it in their stride. Anyway, we
No,
digress.
absolutely. I think on that point, I think there's a sort of apathy with respect to public systems, which is a broader conversation, of course, I would say, which is that people sort of tend to accept the vagaries of public service delivery and urban existence as, just one of those things, take it in your stride and move on, around which there are sort of several debates. One is, how can you ensure more accountable public services? How can you enable citizens to make claims better of the state? Like, how can you sort of bring them together? And then also, how can you create systems where people can come together and co-create what might work? Because I would imagine solutions have to be very local. But anyway, that's
Yeah,
a whole other conversation in
yeah,
of itself.
yeah. But the question I wanted to ask you is that while there are solutions, and you've also pointed out the issues that could come with technology, is investment in urban governance technology too high? Is it a hindrance?
I definitely think there are challenges around it, and I think that's for a variety of reasons. One is that it's hard to move away from the fact that investments, particularly private investments in some of these technologies, are inhibited by the fact that it's very difficult a mountain to scale. So if you think about the complexity of legacy urban systems, you're like, there are much more productive areas that are more immediately visible. So being able to map out and understand and unpack horizons of returns on investments becomes a bit of a difficult thing. The second is that there is, despite all of the evidence around the technological capacity that India holds, and none of this is to undermine any of that, there are challenges with respect to capacities in building ethical, public facing technologies. And I would say some part of it is the difficulty of business models. Consequently, it's not necessarily an attractive career. And similar, equally, engineering schools and education systems are oriented towards sort of some kind of thinking around technology, which means that models that are uncertain or where you're not really sure of the returns become difficult to invest in at a financial or in any other form or fashion. So just being cognizant of the limitations that drive the difficulties of investment in this space is relevant, I would say.
We hear about technologies like the Internet of Things, drones, electric vehicles, sensor networks. All of this sounds very classy and cool and all of that. But has any Indian city actually implemented these in any meaningful way?
Right. So I think we should be a bit careful here around Indian city and public systems. I think there's evidence of private players doing experiments with respect to very many of these things. For example, IoT, many people have sort of devices that can be classified as IoT in their homes. Particularly elites have sort of data-driven systems that are, that like, tell you around, smart TV or something of that sort that exists at a personal level. And some of these might have some community relevance, but there's not really examples of those. But these are private systems where a private individual purchases it from a private service provider. Similarly, with respect to drones, there are examples of, Swiggy trying to do or Zomato, I think, trying to do deliveries through drones. And, there's conversations around some of these things around a lot of like these urban delivery on demand kind of services, trying to tackle some of these questions. I think there's, quite a lot of these that are talked about, but at scale, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that a public system is doing it. Now, the only exception, and it's not really an exception as much as it is tending to be an exception, is perhaps electric vehicles. The Delhi government recently came out with its aggregator policy, which where it's sort of, amongst other things, hark to a policy to move bikes. That's the vehicles that are involved in either delivery or in transportation of people, to move towards electric vehicles. And I mean, the policy is challenging because it doesn't necessarily evidence how it would be a just transition, but it says that there is a vision over the next 2 years, particularly because Delhi has serious challenges around pollution, to move all these vehicles to EVs. Now, of course, all of these shifts, drones, EVs, Internet of Things falls within, I would say, a different kind of realm, come with significant ethical issues attached. Now, EVs, you can transfer into EVs and make a policy saying that everybody should use EVs. And this can be done either for public systems or for, like, you could say all buses should transition into EVs, or you can make a demand that private vehicles also transition into being electric vehicles. But if there's not enough attention paid to, for example, how will these be financed, the purchase of new vehicles, for example, how will there be sort of a charging infrastructure to ensure that there aren't structural issues. So all of these questions are sort of preconditions to some of these transitions. Similarly, with respect to drones, it can have significant consequences in employment. So in the absence of, thinking about what it means from the perspective of workers who rely on these service provision in the city in order to earn a livelihood, without thinking of these transferring into these systems, I don't know what the meaning of it is. So the question I would say in this, just as much as trying to find ways where you can do these cool things, is also thinking about how they'll be just to the various stakeholders that are involved in some of these transitions.
Right. And which Indian city and which global city do you think has done the best job of deploying technology to improve urban governance?
Yeah, I think that's a complicated question. I think there's evidence of different cities having done different things. But I just want to caveat here is that, actually, two caveats. One is that, technology only amplifies intent. And there's a book by Kentaro Tayama, and he says, technology amplifies intent. So if there isn't an intent in the public system, technology can do very little. So in
Yeah.
places where there's already pre-existing intent to do wonderful things around urban service delivery, there has been concomitant impact. So Bangalore has done a few things well, more broadly Karnataka, but definitely Bangalore. Mysore, there's some evidence that technology is very critical. Andhra Pradesh, there's a lot of evidence that cities within Andhra Pradesh, this is through the CDMA, this is, I hesitate to try and expand it. But essentially, Andhra Pradesh uses technology-enabled service delivery on various aspects of urban governance in its urban local bodies. They have done some very interesting things, and they also have a publicly available dashboard through which citizens can track the progress of their application, as well as at an aggregate level get some insight. Punjab is doing very interesting things. This is through the Punjab Municipal Infrastructure Development Corporation. Punjab is doing multiple things. One is they have deployed the technology on the ground, but they've also deployed two other very interesting layers. One is they have tried to build out an integration with WhatsApp, just given the reality that communities and individuals just live their life on WhatsApp, whether it's work or pleasure, everybody is on it. So why not also bring access to governance through it? Then they've also partnered with an organization called Reap Benefit that trains young people within communities to leverage technology with respect to governance. So they've said, we'll deploy technology, that's fine. But how can we make sure that the technology also has a likelihood of success? So they've built out two additional layers around it. I think these would be a few good examples of things that Indian cities have done relevant to the Indian context with respect to urban governance. Of course, the global examples are fairly straightforward. I would say London has done some amazing work with respect to, particularly in the mobility space around technology. If you think about another example of technology, though not necessarily with respect to governance, Estonia, the whole country, but Tallinn in specific, has what is known as X roads, which allows fairly well moderated exchange of data between different entities and institutions. And what that has meant is governance is one layer, of course, and there's several others, insurance, etc., which benefits very significantly from the implementation of this data exchange layer with respect to public technologies. So yes, the short answer is that nobody has done it perfectly, but we can learn from several parts of our own country as well as from the world.
So, what aspects of urban governance is Aapti working on specifically? What's it doing on that front?
Right. So Aapti has a very deep interest in urban governance. And if I may take a minute to introduce ourselves as an organization, we are a think tank working at the intersection of technology and society. And urban governance is one of the verticals that we're very keen on and very interested in. Our aim is to think about justice, equity, and access with respect to technology. So we have a fundamental belief that technology is good. It can be very, very empowering. It can democratize access, but comes with harm. So how do you do harm mitigation is also a critical question for us. Over the years, we've organized, like we sort of discussed before, our work into two big domains. One is we look at individuals and communities as the unit of analysis. We do this through our digital public lab, where we think about how technology affects individuals' lives, well-being, as well as questions of community rights. Then on the other hand, we work with our data economy lab, where we look at questions around data and data governance specifically, and the ways in which data, for example, can be made available for public decision making, for innovation, etc. So both of these are the ways in which we've organized our work, but there's a huge amount of overlap in the way these work out. So I would hesitate to see them as clean distinctions, but more as sort of organizing themes. And over the last few years, we worked on a range of issues with respect to technology. On the one hand, we worked on urban work. So we've looked at platform work. We've looked at the ways in which workers' lives are affected by technology. We work, for example, in doing a participatory governance mechanism with Uber, where we've helped them build out an advisory council of drivers that sort of play a role in discussing a range of issues that affect both the company, but more broadly as well. Our work is in public technologies as well as citizenship. So we look at the ways in which people, reach the state and the state serves its people. We also do a lot of work around the data economy. And so questions around artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, all cut across. So that was a long way of saying that we're very interested in the intersection of technology and society, and we're fairly sector agnostic. Diving specifically into urban governance, we've done quite a bit of work with respect to both the availability of data. So we engage with the Indian Urban Data Exchange in terms of how data can be made available for public decision making in cities. We've also done quite a lot of work around urban governance and access to technology enabled governance. So we did a big piece of work around intermediation and the role community intermediaries play in accessing technology, and thinking about how can they be supported better to do a better job of working with their communities. We also worked with Reap Benefit, the organization that I mentioned, that is doing some amazing work in Punjab to think about how youth intermediaries might be better supported to serve their communities. And of course, all of this is in addition to the fact that we engage very actively in the policy debates around urban governance. So whether it's the formation of the National Urban Digital Mission or more broad conversations around smart cities, we are very actively engaged in the public conversation around this urban service delivery and technology.
So, Sarayu, that brings me to the question I ask all my guests at the end of the show. Why do you do this work?
Right. This is a both an easy and a hard question, I would say. I started Aapti 4 years ago. This 2018, just after my PhD. So I was doing my doctoral fieldwork in Bangalore during the 2014 elections, and mine was a classic, old-fashioned PhD where I spent a year and a half in the field. A lot of it was spent drinking chai, but let's not talk about that. But when I was there, it was impossible to look away from the role technology was playing with respect to all aspects of individual lives, whether it was work, because Ola and Uber were just launching then, whether it's respect to access to public services, because the Aadhaar debates were very big then, or the ways in which people were consuming political information, because the 2014 elections was landmark for a variety of reasons, including the fact that people started to consume a lot of political information and made decisions via technology enabled media. So being in the field as I was, with that intensity, it was impossible to look away from it. And similarly, my co-founder had a similar journey. So we were both on the field between 2014 and 16 in different capacities. A lot of her work related to digitization of public welfare. And so we met, and it was instantaneous, because we were like, we have to do this, because technology is changing all aspects of our lives. It's changing the fiber of society. And how can we as individuals both bring the research and analytical perspective to it, while also maintaining a view on questions of equity, access, and justice. So I think it was a very natural fit and a very natural moment. Though, I mean, I think reflecting on the journey, this was 2018, and 2019, of course, was a very quiet year for us. It was still early days as an organization, and a lot of people were like, technology and society, we don't really get what you're trying to do. But in the most perverse of ways, the pandemic reinforced the need to be critical about the role technology was playing in our society, both from the perspective of what it could do for empowering individuals and communities and society at large, but also from the lens of how do you ensure that there are meaningful protections. This question of inclusion and access, particularly around education, became extremely apparent then. And just to round out the why, the pandemic reinforced the why in a way that we hadn't anticipated, perverse though it was.
Sarayu, there's no doubt that India needs a strong technological push to make urban governance meaningful. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and detailing how.
Thank you so much for having me. And for your listeners, thank you for the patient listen. Should you want to reach out to me or to Aapti, please do so via our website, www.aapti.in, or through our email, which is contact@aapti.in. We are AAPTI.in, not APTI. And thank you for paying attention. And I would urge everybody who's a listener here to continue to engage with the role technology is playing in their lives, both in terms of the good that it brings to various aspects of human existence, but also to some of the big challenges that it brings. And we also always say, and apologies for this long call to action, Ashraf, but we also always say that everybody is an intermediary. So if you see somebody around you for whom technology can be very useful, go out and help them.
Thank you all for listening. Please visit allindiansmatter.in, that's ALLINDIANSMATTER.in, for more columns and audio podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Ashraf Engineer, that's ASHRAFENGINER, and All Indians Count, that's ALLINDIANSCOUNT. Search for the All Indians Matter page on Facebook. On Instagram, the handle is All Indians Matter. Email me at editor@allindiansmatter.in. Catch you again soon.